right, Genesis 27, let's call this one disappointment. Why? Probably because more than any other time that I remember, disappointment seemed to be the dominant emotion of at least the latter half of the chapter, where Jacob has stolen the blessing from his brother Esau, and Isaac and Esau are left to deal with the great disappointment in realizing that Isaac has blessed Jacob above his older brother. And the morality or the ethics of the situation can seem somewhat obscure. The why, in terms of why it happened, seems a little more clear when we realize that Isaac does not seem to understand what God is trying to do in this situation. And if he does, he is choosing to go another way. Whereas Rebekah seems to clearly understand what God is doing in this situation. And therefore, she ends up a lot less disappointed than either Esau or Isaac. And how do we know? Well, going back to chapter 25, it seems to set the context when, before either of the boys are born, she's having enough complications with the pregnancy that she goes to God to find out why. And in verse 23 of chapter 25, he responds by saying, "And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." And it's not clear how much of that gets communicated back to Isaac. Why? Because by the time we get to chapter 27, he is trying to bless Esau, the older, in this way. In verse 29 of 27, it reads, "Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you," directly contradicting what God said the order of things would be for this family. Now, it's possible God's simply saying this is the way it will turn out regardless of God's will. However, when Paul refers back to this story in Romans chapter 9, he literally says that God chose to bless Jacob above Esau before the boys could do right or wrong. And so it seems to clearly say that Paul is under the impression that this was the will of God. And as we look at chapter 27, it looks like Isaac either knowingly or unknowingly is trying to bless Esau, inconsistent with what God is doing in this family. And it ends up with him being greatly disappointed. And counselors will tell you, without regard to spirituality or a belief in God, that we are often disappointed when we set our expectations in unreasonable places. Meaning, if you're doing a 5-year plan, 10-year plan, 20-year plan, however long you want to plan down in the future, if your plans are not objectively reasonable, you are probably setting yourself up for disappointment in much the same way that we see Isaac setting himself up for disappointment here when he is making plans for his sons that are inconsistent with what God has said is actually going to be the order of things with them. And so understand this. Isaac actually has a second chance to avoid great disappointment if he learns something that one of his descendants will understand, and that is Joseph, Jacob's son. After Jacob has gotten the blessing as the younger son, he is going to have a son, Joseph, who is actually going to have his grandkids with one, the younger, blessed above the older. And in chapter 48 of Genesis, we're going to see how that plays out when Jacob, now named Israel, is going to help counsel Joseph through the disappointment of realizing that his younger son is going to be blessed above his older. In verse 14, it reads, "And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn." Verse 17 is going to show us Joseph's response. "When Joseph saw that his father had his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, 'Not this way, my father. Since this one is the firstborn, put your hand on his head.' But his father refused and said, 'I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he.'" And understand how by being adaptable, even though Joseph didn't understand on the front end what God's will necessarily was, he was able to adapt and avoid the disappointment that Isaac and Esau seemed to suffer at the end of Genesis 27. And what's the lesson for us? See, there are times when we can have an inkling that what God has for us is inconsistent with what we want to do. But in ignoring God's will, that's really no defense for the consequences that come for walking a different way. Enter Isaac and Esau. However, even if we have taken a path that's inconsistent with what God has designated as our purpose on this earth is, going back to Abraham, he was blessed to be a blessing. And if we consider ourselves his descendants in the faith, we're here to be a blessing. If we've walked a different path, though, we can at least mitigate the pain of disappointment by adapting to God's will, which is why I often say God's best to you as you go forward in him.